Hello and welcome to Talking Books. I'm Judith Villiers. The book we're featuring today places the spotlight on the Institute for Democracy in South Africa. My guest, Judith February, captured her experiences over a 12-year period working at IDASA in the book Turning and Turning, exploring the complexities of South Africa's democracy. Judith is now based at the Institute of Security Studies and is a visiting fellow at the Wits School of Governance. Judith, thanks so much for coming in and chatting to us.
Thanks, Jill.
First of all, what made you decide to write this book? What was the epiphany? What was the moment that inspired it?
Well, I think that, Jill, as you said in your introduction, I'd spent so many years at the Institute for Democracy in South Africa, IDASA, which is now sadly closed after 27 years of existence. And there I worked a lot on issues of transparency, accountability and good governance, and also found myself in very interesting situations. So whether it was the ANC conference at Polokwane, where Jacob Zuma was elected president of the ANC, whether it was our work on campaign finance, party funding, transparency, and then obviously following political events over the years, 18 years. And it struck me that I might have a story to tell, that after all those years I might have some observations about the trajectory of our democracy, and particularly looking at it through the lens of the Constitution and looking at our democratic institutions and the way in which our politics took a rather strange turns during the Mbeki years and also, of course, the Zuma years, and then looking at where we might be headed given the difficult period we're in at the moment.
Mm-hmm. What was it like monitoring the situation and seeing all the upheavals and still being only able to look at it from an academic perspective, really, and not being able to influence it yourself?
Well, I think at IDASA we did a bit of both. So what we always try to do is, whether it was in our campaigns on party funding, the earliest work I did at IDASA was on the arms deal, looking at the way in which the executive wanting to shut down the investigation into the arms deal, the first case of really grand corruption, how that impacted on our institutions, Parliament, the Public Protector's Office, the Prosecuting Authority, and IDASA, in fact, our Political Information Monitoring Service, of which I was a part, and co-wrote the report, which looked at that, and in fact was the first work that was done on the way in which institutions were impacted. On issues like party funding, we took an academic stance in terms of our research and in terms of looking at possibilities for regulation of private funding to political parties. But we were also an advocacy organisation. So part of what we were doing and part of what I still try to do at the ISS is to be a critical ally. So one is looking at it with the dispassionate lens, but hopefully from the perspective of knowledge and research and fact, and trying then, whether it's through making submissions to Parliament and so on, to influence things. And indeed we saw this year regulation with regard to private funding of political parties. And I think that, you know, the IDASA work that we did there really came full circle.
Now, while you're talking about that, the court case with Judge Griesel,
right.
Tell me about that.
Well, it was very interesting times. You know, it was 2005, and there we were suing the 5 largest political parties, the ANC, of course, being one, the Democratic Alliance, the African Christian Democratic Party, the ACDP, and it was the first time that an NGO had actually taken on the ruling party in such a public way. But it was very interesting. Apart from the ACDP, all of the parties were agreed that this was, they didn't really want us to know who was funding them. And so it put us on a sort of collision course, and a collision course, I think, with the ANC. Then Secretary General Kgalema Motlanthe was not very happy with our litigation. But I remember seeing him at a conference in Oxford in 2014, and he came up to me and said, Judith, what happened with your party funding matter? And I sort of took that as him thinking, well, actually, maybe you did have a point, although he didn't admit it in 2005. But it was an interesting case. We obviously brought the case in terms of the Promotion of Access to Information Act, PIA, and we said that the public has the right to know who funds our political parties. Unfortunately, the courts did not agree with us, and also did not agree that the public needed this information to exercise their right to vote. And of course we were very disappointed, but decided not to appeal, and I covered that in the book because I think that we should have, but hindsight is 20/20 vision. So and then other organisations carried on and took up the matter. My Vote Counts, for example, and there was a triumph in the Constitutional Court a few months ago. So advocacy is really about passing the baton, that one organisation like IDASA, we started that conversation and kept it going for 10, 12 years, and others took it up. And so in a sense, the success of that belongs to civil society. But I was glad that we played our part in that.
In the time that you were there, what was it that most upset you or most disturbed you?
Well, I think there were enough moments in South African public life that could upset one. I think that going to the ANC conference at Polokwane was certainly, it was an eye-opener. It was really interesting. You know, you saw firsthand what it was like with regard to Jacob Zuma and his stranglehold over the party, and the seeds of intolerance that were planted during that time. I remember arriving at Polokwane, and I also talk about this in the book, you know, drenched because it was raining so much in December. And people were in this marquee and making the football signs, the hand turns, to say that Mbeki needs to go. And there was a moment at Polokwane, Jill, where Thabo Mbeki was trying to address the crowd, but they wouldn't let him because they were shouting him down, they wanted Zuma and so on. And Thabo Mbeki sort of leaned over to Jacob Zuma and basically trying to get him to silence the crowd. And Zuma looked straight ahead of him and ignored it. And that for me was an interesting moment because it showed the seeds of intolerance, and also that Jacob Zuma was prepared to humiliate Mbeki in that setting, and was really ruthless about wanting to take power. And I think all of us who were commentating or analysing Polokwane, we were glad to leave there on the 21st of December, but we realised that something had shifted. And so that was difficult. But I also think that in the book I talk about the day that the opening of Parliament and the signal was jammed. I think it was 2015, and the journalists were up in the gallery saying, in the media boxes, shouting, "Bring back the signal." And again, you realised how far Jacob Zuma would go to keep his grip on the state. And also when he took the podium and simply laughed, all those occasions. I mean, in the book I say that that night, some part of our democracy died. And so there have been lots of sort of difficult and awkward moments, yeah.
Mm. And at one point you say that you think Kgalema Motlanthe was perhaps the best president we never had.
Well, he's an organic intellectual, isn't he? And he is, he's a measured man. Look, he made mistakes in the time that he was Secretary General of the ANC. And I remember my colleague Jonathan Fall and I were at Polokwane, and Motlanthe read out the entire Secretary General's report, but he managed to sort of distance himself from quite a lot of the chaos that was happening within the ANC and also the corruption. You know, he then said that the cancer of corruption is eating away at our party. He's a fascinating man, and as I mentioned before, I was in Oxford at a South Africa conference about South Africa in Oxford, and he spoke at that meeting. He was the keynote speaker. And he commands a great deal of respect. He reads widely, he is thoughtful. But I think that at the end of the day, the pressures have simply got to him. And also the balance of forces within the ANC was such that he was never going to get that job permanently. And so, yeah, so I have a great deal, for what it's worth, of regard for him. And I think that he is a sane voice, an elder within the ANC now.
Another thing that runs right through the book is the matter of race. Mm. And you also address this at one point talking about black pain, that unless white people can experience black pain, real change will not happen.
Well, I talk about it, Jill, in the context of the Fees Must Fall protests. And there is a chapter in my book on protest and on burning, because we're in a complicated moment, and it's not new, but this phenomenon of burning things to get attention, because citizens go, if we don't burn things, nobody listens to us. And the critique that I make, what I try to make around the issue of black pain is a critique of Anthea Garman's piece that she has written, an academic piece. She's a professor at Rhodes University, and she talks about this concept of black pain. I think sometimes it shuts down many conversations, because I think that, you know, once we get to a point where we say that black pain, and it is acknowledged, it's difficult then to take the conversation further, because it often is a conversation stopper, and we saw that in the Fees Must Fall movement. And the point that I was trying to make in the chapter is that we often try to reason is often undermined in the public discourse because affect or emotion takes center stage, and that's particularly with the issue of pain. And we have to find a way in our public discourse to deal with that, because if we don't, we end up in cul-de-sac politics, which is what happened in the Fees Must Fall movement and so on, and it becomes destructive. And I think we could be having richer conversations if there was an acknowledgement of pain and of all our collective trauma, but also needed to move on and to say, so how do we transform and reimagine?
One last question, and that is democracy is something that we will have to work on a constant basis?
Absolutely, and in the last chapter of my book, I talk about reimagining South Africa, and how do we become active citizens? We do tend to look only at the ANC and go, it's all falling apart because the ANC, and of course the ANC occupies a very large part of our public discourse, and what it does is important. But of course, you and I, we all have our role to play. And so the last part of my book, I talk a lot about active citizenship, about the way in which we can harness communities and energies within communities. That is the only way democracy survives. And institutions are only as strong as those who are in them or head them up, but also our demand for accountability. So we all have to sort of be sharpening our pencils and putting on our boots, because otherwise our democracy becomes a bit of a passing show.
Okay, one last thing, do you have hope?
I do, and in the book I say at the end that I still remain hopeful about South Africa every day, but the centre, and the title of the book is Turning and Turning, and it has a Yeatsian connotation, but the centre has to hold, and that means that we need to get certain things right. And at the end of my book I talk about leadership, about issues of education, about fixing the economy, and how that political centre has to hold if we are going to fulfill our potential. But I think there are a lot of positive things that happen in our country, and equally many negative things. So I still see the glass half full.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Judith, for coming in and chatting to us.
Thank you.
And that was Judith February, and the book is Turning and Turning, Exploring the Complexities of South Africa's Democracy. Thanks for watching, and see you again soon.